They found him hanging from a tree in his backyard. The police took one look and closed the case within 24 hours. Suicide, they said, open and shut. But his hands were bound behind his back. His body showed signs of a struggle. His family said he'd never been depressed, never talked about ending his life, had plans for the future. Witnesses saw suspicious activity near his home the night before. The autopsy had inconsistencies that experts said didn't match suicide. And yet the official ruling stood. Suicide, case closed, move along. This is the story of Kendrick Hayes, a 27-year-old black man found dead under circumstances that his family, his community, and multiple experts say simply don't add up. A death that was ruled suicide so quickly, so definitively, that it raises more questions than it answers. Because when you look at the evidence, really look at it, you start to see the holes, the contradictions, the things that don't make sense, the details that were ignored or dismissed or explained away. And you start to wonder, was this really suicide? Or was it something else that someone wanted to look like suicide? This is about a death that the authorities refuse to reinvestigate, about a family that won't stop fighting for the truth, about evidence that tells a very different story than the official one. They called it a suicide, but the evidence says otherwise. And what that evidence suggests is far more disturbing than anyone wants to admit. Let me tell you who Kendrick Hayes was, because that matters, because the official narrative tried to make him into someone he wasn't. Kendrick was 27 years old when he died, born and raised in Valdosta, Georgia. He was the second of 4 children, 2 older brothers, 1 younger sister. His parents, Marcus and Diane Hayes, had been married 32 years. They ran a small landscaping business, working-class family, tight-knit, the kind of family where everyone showed up for Sunday dinners and knew each other's business. Kendrick worked with his father in the landscaping business, had been doing it since he was 16. He was good with his hands, good with people, good at building things. He'd been saving money to start his own construction company, had already lined up 3 clients, had a business plan written out, was meeting with a loan officer the week after he died. He had a girlfriend, Amber Wilson. They'd been together 3 years. He just bought an engagement ring. Hadn't proposed yet, was planning to do it on her birthday in 2 weeks. His mother knew about the ring. His brothers knew. He'd shown it to them, excited and nervous like any man about to ask the love of his life to marry him. He had no history of depression, no diagnosed mental health issues. He'd never attempted suicide, never talked about suicide, never displayed any of the warning signs that people who work in suicide prevention are trained to recognize. His friends described him as upbeat, optimistic, always the one cracking jokes, making people laugh. He loved life, loved his family, loved his girlfriend, loved his work. He was, by every account from everyone who knew him, a man with everything to live for. So when his mother found him hanging from a tree in his backyard on the morning of March 8th, 2024, her first thought wasn't suicide. Her first thought was, someone killed my son. But the authorities didn't see it that way. Let me walk you through what happened that day, the timeline, the details, the things that don't add up. March 7th, 2024, a Thursday evening. Kendrick finished work around 6 p.m. He came home to the house he rented about 2 miles from his parents' place. Small house, 3 bedrooms, decent yard. He lived alone, though Amber stayed over most nights. That evening, Amber was working a night shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She texted Kendrick around 7 p.m. He responded. They had a normal conversation. He asked about her shift, told her he loved her, said he'd see her tomorrow. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning. Around 8:30 p.m., Kendrick's neighbor, a man named Robert Martinez, was taking out his trash. He saw Kendrick outside working on his truck in the driveway. They waved to each other. Robert said Kendrick seemed normal, was listening to music, looked like he was in a good mood. Around 9 p.m., another neighbor, Janice Freeman, heard what sounded like raised voices coming from Kendrick's property. She couldn't make out words, but it sounded like an argument. She didn't think much of it at the time. Sound carries weird in that neighborhood, and she wasn't sure where it was coming from. Around 9:45 p.m., a car was seen leaving Kendrick's driveway. This was witnessed by a teenager named Marcus Powell who lived 3 houses down. Marcus was outside shooting hoops in his driveway. He saw a dark-colored sedan. He thinks it was a Nissan or Honda, something common, leaving Kendrick's house. He noticed it because the car was moving fast, faster than people usually drive in a residential neighborhood. He didn't see the driver or get a license plate number. That was the last time anyone reported seeing activity at Kendrick's house that night. The next morning, March 8th, around 7:30 a.m., Kendrick's mother, Diane, came by the house. This was normal. She often stopped by to bring him breakfast or just check in. She was a mother who stayed involved in her children's lives. She knocked on the front door. No answer. She called his phone. It went to voicemail. She walked around to the backyard to see if maybe he was out there working on something. That's when she found him. Kendrick's body was hanging from a large oak tree in his backyard. He was suspended by what appeared to be a rope around his neck, about 5 feet off the ground. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before: jeans, a t-shirt, work boots. Diane screamed, collapsed, somehow got to her phone and called 911. The police arrived within 10 minutes. They cut him down. The EMTs pronounced him dead at the scene. He'd been dead for hours. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, the EMT estimated he died sometime between 10 p.m. the previous night and 2 a.m. that morning. And here's where things start to get strange. The responding officers took one look at the scene and made an immediate determination: suicide by hanging. They noted it in their initial report. They didn't treat it as a potential crime scene. They didn't secure the area. They didn't look for evidence of foul play. They saw a body hanging from a tree and decided that's all it was. But Diane, even in her grief and shock, noticed things that didn't make sense. Kendrick's hands were behind his back. When they cut him down, she saw that his wrists were bound together with what looked like zip ties. There were marks on his arms and torso, bruises, scratches, signs of a struggle. The ground beneath where he was hanging was disturbed, scuffed, like there had been a fight. And the rope around his neck, it wasn't tied the way you'd expect someone to tie it themselves. It was a complex knot, professional looking, the kind of knot that takes practice to tie. Diane tried to tell the officers this, tried to point out these inconsistencies, but they dismissed her concerns. Grief, they said. She was in shock. She wasn't seeing clearly. People in trauma often imagine things that aren't there. They took photos, they took the body, they wrote their report, and they ruled it a suicide. Within 24 hours, the case was closed. No investigation, no interviews with neighbors, no examination of Kendrick's phone records or computer, no autopsy beyond the most basic examination, no consideration that this might be anything other than what it appeared to be at first glance. Just suicide, file it, move on. The Hayes family didn't accept it, couldn't accept it because they knew their son, and they knew something was wrong. They hired a private investigator, a man named David Chen, who'd worked homicide for the Atlanta PD for 20 years before retiring and going private. He specialized in cases where families felt the official investigation had been inadequate. David Chen looked at the case file, what little there was of it, and immediately had concerns. First, the bound hands. The official police report mentioned that Kendrick's hands were behind his back but described it as possibly self-restrained. The theory was that Kendrick had bound his own hands before hanging himself to prevent himself from being able to save himself at the last minute. But here's the problem with that theory. The zip ties were tight, very tight. tight enough that they'd left deep marks in Kendrick's wrists. Medical examiners who reviewed the case later said the tightness suggested they'd been applied by someone else, likely during a struggle, not carefully self-applied. Moreover, the position of the ties, the way they were looped and secured, would have been extremely difficult to do to yourself. Try it. Put your hands behind your back and imagine zip-tying your own wrists together tightly. It's possible, technically, but it's awkward and difficult. And you'd have to do it knowing you were about to hang yourself, which requires a level of commitment that doesn't match the psychology of someone who's ambivalent enough about dying that they need to restrain themselves. Suicide experts who reviewed the case said that while self-restraint does happen in suicide cases, it's extremely rare. Less than 1% of hanging suicides involve self-restraint, and when it does happen, it's usually much looser, more symbolic than functional. The way Kendrick's hands were bound didn't fit that pattern. Second, the injuries on his body. The police report noted minor bruising consistent with final struggles. But the autopsy photos, which the family eventually obtained through a lawyer, showed more than minor bruising. There were defensive wounds on Kendrick's forearms, the kind of marks you get when you're raising your arms to protect yourself from blows. There were contusions on his ribs, scratches on his neck, not from the rope, but from what looked like fingernails, either his own as he fought against someone or someone else's during a struggle. A forensic pathologist named Dr. Rebecca Martinez reviewed the autopsy photos at the family's request. Her conclusion: these injuries are more consistent with assault than with suicide. The pattern suggests this man was in a physical altercation shortly before his death. Third, the rope and the knot. The rope used was not found in Kendrick's house or garage. Police never determined where it came from. It wasn't the kind of rope Kendrick used for his landscaping work. That was a different type, a different thickness. This was marine-grade rope, the kind used for boats. Kendrick didn't own a boat, had never expressed interest in boating, had no reason to have marine-grade rope. So where did it come from? The police report doesn't address this question. The knot was a clove hitch with a running end, a specific type of knot used in sailing and climbing. It's not a knot that most people know how to tie. It takes practice. It's efficient and strong, the kind of knot someone with training would use. Kendrick had no background in sailing or climbing. No one in his family knew if he'd ever learned to tie knots beyond basic ones. But someone who wanted to hang someone else would need to know how to tie a knot that would hold weight and tighten properly. A clove hitch with a running end does exactly that. Fourth, the timeline doesn't make sense. If Kendrick died between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., as the coroner estimated, what was he doing outside in his backyard at that hour? It was March. In Georgia, that time of night is cold, around 45 degrees. Kendrick had been wearing just a t-shirt and jeans. No jacket. No shoes. His work boots were on his feet, but they were unlaced, like he'd put them on quickly or they'd been put on him. Why would someone go out into their cold backyard late at night, improperly dressed, to hang themselves from a tree? It doesn't fit the pattern of planned suicide. People who plan to hang themselves typically do it inside in a private space where they won't be found quickly. Doing it outside in a backyard where neighbors could potentially see is unusual, unless he didn't go out there voluntarily. Fifth, there was no note. Now, not all suicide victims leave notes. Statistics say only about 25–30% do. So the absence of a note doesn't prove anything. But combined with everything else, the lack of history of depression, the plans for the future, the engagement ring he just bought, the absence of any explanation becomes more significant. Kendrick's phone records showed he'd made plans for the following week. He'd texted a client about a landscaping job scheduled for Monday. He'd confirmed dinner plans with his parents for Sunday. He'd been looking at venues for a potential proposal. These aren't the actions of someone planning to end their life within hours. Sixth, the scene itself. David Chen, the private investigator, noted several anomalies. The ladder. There was a ladder leaning against the tree when Kendrick was found. The police assumed he'd used it to climb up and hang himself. But the ladder was positioned oddly, not directly under where the body was hanging, but off to the side. And there were no fingerprints on the ladder except on the very bottom rung. If Kendrick had climbed it, there should have been prints higher up. The dirt. The ground around the tree was scuffed and disturbed, as I mentioned earlier. But there were also what appeared to be drag marks, parallel lines in the dirt leading from the back door of the house to the tree, like something heavy had been dragged. The neighbors. Remember Janice Freeman, who heard raised voices around 9 p.m., and Marcus Powell, who saw a dark sedan leaving quickly around 9:45 p.m. The police never interviewed either of them, never followed up on these potential leads, never tried to identify who might have been at Kendrick's house that night. When David Chen interviewed them, both were willing to testify about what they'd seen and heard. Both said the police had never contacted them. And seventh, maybe most damning, there's what wasn't done. The police didn't process the scene as a potential crime scene, collect evidence beyond photos and the body, interview neighbors or friends, check Kendrick's phone records or computer, look for signs of forced entry to the house, test the rope for DNA or fingerprints, consider any alternative explanation. They decided it was suicide within the first hour and never reconsidered that determination, no matter what evidence might have suggested otherwise. The Hayes family demanded answers. They went to the police chief. They went to the mayor. They went to the district attorney. They hired lawyers. They contacted civil rights organizations. And they got nowhere. The official response was always the same. The investigation was thorough. The evidence clearly indicated suicide. While we understand the family's grief, reopening the case isn't warranted. But here's what thorough meant in this case. The initial police report was 3 pages long, 3 pages for a death investigation. It contained basic details, time, location, description of the scene, no analysis, no consideration of alternative theories, no list of evidence collected or witnesses interviewed. Because there were no witnesses interviewed, there was almost no evidence collected beyond the photographs. The autopsy report was similarly brief. Cause of death, asphyxiation due to hanging. Manner of death, suicide. A few notes about the injuries described as consistent with terminal struggle and minor, not indicative of assault. No toxicology beyond basic drug screening. No analysis of the restraints. No detailed examination of the injuries to determine if they were self-inflicted or from an attack. The case was assigned to Detective James Morrison. He closed it within 18 hours of Kendrick's body being discovered. When the family tried to contact him with questions, he was dismissive, told them their son had killed himself and they needed to accept it and move on with their grieving process. When David Chen, the private investigator, tried to share his findings with Detective Morrison, the detective refused to meet with him, said private investigators weren't law enforcement and he didn't have time for amateur theories. The family's lawyer filed a formal request for the case to be reopened. It was denied. The stated reason: no new evidence has been presented that would warrant reopening a closed investigation. But how could there be new evidence when there was barely an initial investigation? This is where the story gets darker. Because the more the family pushed, the more they started to uncover about why the police might not want to look too closely at Kendrick's death. 2 weeks before he died, Kendrick had witnessed something. He'd been driving home from a job site around 9 p.m. when he saw what looked like a drug deal going down in a parking lot near his house. He slowed down, natural curiosity, and one of the men involved noticed him, made eye contact. The man was white, middle-aged, wearing what looked like a nice suit, not the typical profile of a street-level dealer. Kendrick told his girlfriend about it, told his friend Marcus, Different Marcus, his best friend from high school, said it was weird. Said the guy in the suit had given him a look that made him uncomfortable, like a warning. Marcus, the friend, asked if Kendrick had reported it. Kendrick said no, didn't think it was his business, didn't want trouble. But a week later, Kendrick mentioned to his father that he'd seen the same man again, this time at a gas station. The man had recognized him, had approached him, had said something threatening. Kendrick didn't give his father details, but he said the man had made it clear that Kendrick should forget what he'd seen. Kendrick's father asked if they should go to the police. Kendrick said no, said he didn't trust the police in Valdosta, said there were rumors about cops being involved in the local drug trade, though he had no proof. 3 days later, Kendrick was dead. Now I want to be clear. We don't know if these incidents are connected to Kendrick's death. We don't know if the man in the suit had anything to do with it. This could be coincidence. But here's what we do know. When David Chen, the private investigator, started asking questions about possible drug connections, he hit a wall. Not just resistance, but active obstruction. Sources who'd been willing to talk to him suddenly weren't. One man who'd agreed to an interview canceled last minute, saying he'd been advised that it wasn't a good idea to get involved. David received a warning, an anonymous phone call telling him to drop the case, to stop asking questions about things that weren't his business. And when he submitted his findings to the district attorney, requesting a formal review of the case, he was told that his investigation was speculative and not based on credible evidence. This despite the forensic pathologist's report, despite the expert analysis of the knot, despite the witness statements, despite the photographic evidence of injuries inconsistent with suicide. All of it dismissed as speculation. The Hayes family started a petition calling for the case to be reopened. It got over 50,000 signatures. Civil rights organizations got involved. The NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center. They held press conferences. They organized protests. And the official response remained. This was thoroughly investigated and determined to be a suicide. But it wasn't thoroughly investigated. That's the point. It was quickly classified and closed, and any attempt to look deeper was shut down. Why? That's the question that haunts this case. Is it incompetence? Is the Valdosta Police Department just poorly trained in death investigation? Are they understaffed and overworked, cutting corners to clear cases quickly? Or is it something more sinister? Is there a reason they don't want to look closely at Kendrick Hayes' death? Is there something or someone they're protecting? I don't have the answer to that. No one outside the department does. But the refusal to even consider alternative explanations, the active resistance to reopening the case despite credible evidence that warrants it, that raises questions. Kendrick Hayes' case isn't unique. It fits a disturbing pattern of black men found hanging under suspicious circumstances, with their deaths quickly ruled suicide despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Let me give you some names. Lennon Lacey, 17 years old, found hanging from a swing set in Bladenboro, North Carolina in 2014. His mother said he'd been receiving threats from white residents who were upset he was dating a white woman. His shoes were the wrong size, not his shoes. His body was too low to the ground for the hanging to have been self-inflicted without a struggle. The FBI investigated and found insufficient evidence to determine it was anything other than suicide. Otis Byard, 54 years old, found hanging from a tree in Mississippi in 2015. He'd been missing for 2 weeks. His death was ruled suicide, but his family said he had no history of mental illness and had been in good spirits. The circumstances were similar to lynchings, hanging from a tree in the rural South, a black man, no apparent witnesses. Roy Veal, 55 years old, found hanging from a tree in Woodville, Mississippi in 2016. Family said he had no reason to kill himself, had plans for the future. The investigation lasted less than a day before it was ruled suicide. Tati Gully, 40 years old, found hanging from a tree in the woods in Georgia in 2016, had just started a new job, was planning her son's upcoming birthday party. Family said she would never kill herself, ruled suicide. The list goes on and on. Black men and women found hanging under circumstances that their families say don't match suicide, but that are quickly ruled as such. There's a history here we can't ignore: lynching. For over a century, hanging was the preferred method of racist terror in America. Black people were strung up from trees as punishment, as warning, as entertainment for white mobs. These weren't suicides. They were murders, executions without trial. And even though lynching is now illegal, even though we like to think we've moved past that era, the echoes remain. Black bodies hanging from trees still carry that historical weight. And when those deaths are quickly ruled suicide without thorough investigation, it feels like erasure. Like the authorities are more comfortable with a suicide narrative than with the possibility that racial violence still happens. I'm not saying every suspicious hanging is a lynching or a murder. Mental illness affects all communities. Suicide is a real and tragic phenomenon across all racial groups. Some of these cases may well be what they appear to be. But the lack of thorough investigation is the problem. The rush to judgment, the dismissal of family concerns, the refusal to consider alternative explanations even when evidence warrants it. When a white person is found dead under unusual circumstances, the investigation is typically extensive. Every possibility is considered. The case stays open until investigators are certain of what happened. When a black person is found dead under unusual circumstances, especially hanging, there's often a rush to call it suicide and close the case. The assumption is made quickly and defended stubbornly, even when evidence contradicts it. That disparity isn't accidental. It's rooted in the same racism that made lynching possible in the first place. The devaluation of black lives, the assumption that black people's deaths aren't worth the same level of scrutiny and care. Dr. Angela Davis, a forensic psychologist who studies suicide in black communities, said something that stuck with me. The suicide ruling has become the modern equivalent of justifiable homicide. It's a way to close cases without investigation, to avoid uncomfortable questions, to maintain the status quo. And it disproportionately affects black victims because there's a long history of not caring enough about black deaths to look closely at them. In Kendrick Hayes' case, the police made a decision within hours and refused to reconsider it despite mounting evidence that it might be wrong. They chose the explanation that required the least work, the least scrutiny, the least disruption to whatever else might be going on. And that choice, that lack of care, that refusal to investigate, that's what his family is fighting against. The Hayes family has been clear about what they think happened to Kendrick. They believe he was murdered. They believe it was connected to what he witnessed, the drug deal, the man in the suit, the threatening encounter. They believe his death was made to look like suicide to cover up a crime. They believe the police either know this and are covering it up, or don't want to know because it would implicate people with power or connections. They believe Kendrick was killed in or near his home, then taken to the backyard and hanged to stage a suicide. The bound hands, the injuries, the drag marks, the rope from an unknown source, all of it points to someone else being involved. They believe that if Kendrick had been white from an affluent neighborhood, the investigation would have been different, more thorough, less quick to close, more willing to consider foul play. David Chen, the private investigator, agrees. In his professional opinion, based on 40 years of law enforcement experience, this case has all the hallmarks of a homicide staged as a suicide. The evidence doesn't support the official ruling. I've investigated hundreds of hangings, and I can tell you with confidence that this one doesn't fit the pattern of suicide. The bound hands alone are a massive red flag. But combined with the injuries, the suspicious activity that night, the lack of suicidal ideation, the rushed investigation, it all points to something else happening here. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic pathologist, echoes that assessment. The injury pattern is wrong for suicide. The defensive wounds, the bruising on the torso, the marks that suggest restraint and struggle, these are assault injuries. This man was in a fight before he died. Whether that fight ended in murder or something else, I can't say. But calling this a clear-cut suicide ignores significant medical evidence. But here's the problem. Without the police reopening the investigation, without access to evidence that was never properly collected, without interviews that were never conducted, there's no way to prove what happened. The family can hire all the experts they want. They can present all the evidence Chen and Martinez have compiled. They can get 50,000 signatures or 500,000 signatures on a petition. Unless someone with official power decides to look at this case again, Kendrick Hayes' death will remain what the police say it is: suicide. And that's what makes this so devastating. It's not just about one death. It's about a system that allows deaths to be quickly categorized and filed away without real investigation. A system that trusts law enforcement to make those determinations, even when law enforcement has proven to be careless or biased or actively corrupt. It's about who gets justice and who doesn't, who gets thorough investigation and who gets a 3-page report and a closed case. The Hayes family isn't giving up. They've filed a civil lawsuit against the Valdosta Police Department for wrongful death and negligent investigation. That lawsuit is ongoing. They've contacted federal authorities, the FBI, the DOJ, requesting a civil rights investigation. So far, they've been told it doesn't meet the threshold for federal involvement. They've kept Kendrick's story alive on social media, in the press, in their community. They've turned their grief into action, their pain into persistence. Diane Hayes, Kendrick's mother, said something in an interview that captures what this fight is really about. They want us to accept that my son, my healthy, happy, planning his future son, woke up one day and decided to tie his own hands behind his back and hang himself from a tree in his backyard in the middle of the night for no reason. They want us to believe that. And when we say that doesn't make sense, they treat us like we're in denial, like we just can't accept that our son was suicidal. But we're not in denial. We're paying attention. We're looking at the evidence. We're asking the questions they should have asked from the beginning. And what we see doesn't add up. None of it adds up. And we will not stop fighting until someone with power agrees to actually investigate what happened to our son, because he deserves that. He deserves the truth. He deserves justice. And if they won't give it to him, then we'll spend the rest of our lives demanding it. So what really happened to Kendrick Hayes? I can't tell you definitively. No one can, because the investigation that should have happened didn't. But I can tell you what the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests Kendrick Hayes did not die by suicide in the way the official report claims. The bound hands, the injuries, the rope from an unknown source, the witnesses who saw and heard suspicious activity, all of it points to someone else being involved in his death. Whether that involvement was murder, manslaughter, or something else, we can't know. Not without a real investigation. Not without examining evidence that was never collected, interviewing witnesses who were never contacted, considering theories that were never explored. The police decided within hours what happened and built their entire case around that decision. They ignored contradictory evidence. They dismissed family concerns. They closed the case and moved on. And that's the real crime here. Not necessarily what happened to Kendrick, though if he was murdered, that's obviously a crime that should be prosecuted. But the crime of not looking, of not caring enough to investigate thoroughly, of choosing the convenient explanation over the truthful one. This happens more often than we want to acknowledge. Deaths are misclassified. Cases are closed prematurely. Families are left without answers because the people with power to get those answers decided it wasn't worth the effort. And it disproportionately happens to Black people, to people from poor communities, to people whose lives are considered less valuable, whose deaths are considered less worthy of investigation. That's what makes this a civil rights issue, not just a criminal justice issue. It's about equal treatment under the law, about whether your death gets investigated with the same thoroughness regardless of your race or class. Kendrick Hayes was 27 years old. He had a family who loved him, a girlfriend he was planning to propose to, a business he was building, a future he was working toward. And then he was found dead under circumstances that don't add up, and the authorities called it suicide and moved on. His family hasn't moved on. They're still fighting, still demanding answers, still refusing to accept the official story. Because they know their son, they know the evidence, and they know something is wrong. They called it a suicide, but the evidence says otherwise. The bound hands say otherwise, the injuries say otherwise, the timeline says otherwise, the rope says otherwise, the witnesses say otherwise, the experts say otherwise. Everything says otherwise except the official report. And until someone in power is willing to look at this case with fresh eyes and honest intentions, we'll never know the full truth of what happened on March 8th, 2024 in that backyard in Valdosta, Georgia. But we know enough to know this. The investigation was inadequate. The ruling was premature. The family deserves better. Kendrick Hayes deserved better. And somewhere out there, if this was indeed a murder, someone is walking free because the authorities decided it was easier to call it suicide than to do the hard work of finding out what really happened. That should disturb all of us. That should make all of us question how many other cases like this exist, how many other families are fighting for answers they'll never get, how many other deaths have been misclassified, filed away, forgotten. Say his name, Kendrick Hayes. Question the official story. Demand thorough investigations. Support families who are fighting for the truth. Because some deaths are called suicide when the evidence says otherwise. And until we demand better, until we hold law enforcement accountable for actually investigating, those deaths will keep happening. The case is closed, they say. But the questions remain. And they won't go away until someone has the courage to answer them. The Valdosta Police Department maintains Kendrick Hayes died by suicide. His family continues to fight for the case to be reopened. Experts say the evidence doesn't support the official ruling. When investigations are inadequate, families are left without justice. Demand thorough investigation for all suspicious deaths. Question everything, trust evidence, fight for truth.